How's it going, everyone? Jiivita here with a kind of elemental debuff crash course. So these are debuffs that are applied by elemental creatures in Boundless, and yeah, unfortunately the elemental sling bows do not apply these debuffs, only the creatures can put them onto you. You might see a couple of places in some of the footage that I might be applying like corrosion bleed or something. That is because I have the forge bleed effect forged onto the sling bow, and it just happens to do the same type of damage that the bow is already doing. It's not that the corrosion sling bow is applying a bleed on its own. But anyway, let's get down to business. In order to get an elemental debuff, not that you really want to get them, but to know which attacks you really want to dodge, are basically all of the special attacks you kind of already want to dodge. So Elemental Wildstock can in no way give you an elemental debuff because they just have the one attack and it's standard and they don't apply debuffs. Spitter projectiles, most of them will not apply debuffs. The only spitter projectile that will apply debuff are the really large knockback power shots, and those can come in either a single power shot or even a kind of a spread of 3 power shots, but all of those will apply debuff. Also, just about any kind of bomb from a spitter or cuddle trunk will also apply debuff if it's coming from an elemental creature. Strangely enough, I was really surprised. I thought hoppers applied debuffs, but apparently they do not, and they're also not very adept at hitting you in the first place. So there's a little bit of that too, but I certainly had several hit me and they didn't apply debuffs, maybe because they were too small, but I'm not about to let an elite hopper hit me. 1, because that's really going to hurt, and 2, I would a lot rather try to get a hopper core trophy out of it rather than letting it just about kill me. So there is that. But moving along to cuddle trunks, they're the other ones that are going to be able to apply a debuff, and they will apply debuffs, of course, with their bombs, as I said earlier, but also their homing projectiles will also apply the debuff. So there's not a whole lot you can do to dodge those. If you can align it just right, you can use the environment to block the projectiles, but usually the small ones, they move so fast, they're really hard to dodge, and the big ones, you can sort of try to outrun them, especially if you have a grapple, but usually they're going to end up hitting you. And if you try to use the terrain, usually the explosion is big enough that it kind of, you get caught in the AoE effect anyway. So those homing attacks are really annoying, but if you bring either some cleansing brews or some cleansing bombs, you can quickly remove the debuff. Particularly with the cleansing bombs, you can just walk up to a corpse and throw it at the corpse, which will cause the bomb to go ahead and blow up. Otherwise, you kind of have to chase it rolling around on the ground or throw it at your feet and just wait for it to blow up, which, if things are trying to kill you, that's not really a great idea to stand around and twiddle your thumbs, so to speak. But anyway, let's get down to business of actually going over what these debuffs do. Some of them I didn't even know what they did, and it's only been through the recent patch changes that we can finally see a description of what they do. And yeah, that chilling or frozen debuff, for the longest time nobody has known what it does. I did go into the game files to see exactly what these debuffs are changing, like value wise, but let's start off, let's say, with the poison debuff. This one's pretty straightforward. If you get hit by one of those special elemental attacks, it's going to, well, poison you, which simply does damage over time. So going over all the different ranks of the poison debuff, I was a little bit confused at first because the game files would suggest that rank 1 would be 10 damage, then it goes up to 25, 50, 100, and then 200 for rank 5 of the poison debuff, which just doesn't reflect reality. What I finally figured out was that because they're the creatures and they're the enemy, for whatever reason, they get 5 times the damage. So really, rank 1 does 50 damage, rank 2 125, going up to 250, then 500, and then finally 1000 damage per tick at rank 5. So that can be pretty much a death sentence depending on how much health you have and what tools you have available to try to either heal yourself through that much damage, or how fast can you cleanse it off, because it might take 1 or 2 bombs or 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 potions to cleanse off such a powerful debuff. So that can certainly be a little bit a tricky one to deal with, but it really depends on what creature is attacking you. So low level spitters and cuddle trunks, they just won't apply a very strong debuff. However, if you have that elite cuddle trunk that's toxic, you might consider just letting somebody else deal with that if you don't want to have to deal with the poison debuff. Next up, we have the acid debuff. This is a really pretty nasty debuff, I guess, depending on your play style. So if you are a tank that relies on a lot of armor and resistances, this is basically your worst nightmare, because it simply sets all of your armor, all of your resistances down to 0 for all ranks. So it doesn't matter if you get rank 1 acid debuff or rank 5 acid debuff, it reduces everything down to 0. It's kind of evil, I have to say, but it certainly keeps your attention on what's going on with your debuffs. If you already play highly defensive and kind of dodging rather than tanking things with your armor, then you might not fear this debuff quite as bad, but it can be pretty devastating if you're relying on those resistances and or armor. Next up, one of my all-time least favorite debuffs is the slow debuff. These come from the blast creatures, and yeah, this slows not only your movement speed but your action speed. The action speed doesn't bother me too much, but that movement speed just can be brutal. So taking a look at rank 1, it reduces action speed by 20% and movement speed by 30%. Rank 2, it does both by 40%. Rank 3, it does action speed by 60%, and then movement speed gets chopped in half. So that is pretty devastating right there. Rank 4, action speed 80%, movement speed minus 60%, and then finally rank 5, strangely it says -1 for action speed. So that would suggest 100% minus action speed, which I don't see how that's really possible. I've never been unable to attack with a slow debuff, but that's kind of strange. But then it reduces your movement speed by a staggering 70%. So if you're somebody that heavily relies on mobility and dodging to avoid your damage, this is not a good debuff to get, and that's why it's one of my least favorites, because that's generally my play style, is to careful aim and lots of dodging. So this is particularly detrimental to me. Next up, this one can be kind of bad. It's Scar, and it's applied by the burn creatures, and it reduces your maximum HP by 1%. So rank 1 is 10%, and then it goes up by 10% all the way up to rank 5, which is 50%. So this can be a pretty nasty one, especially for a tank that relies on high HP, or just anybody that relies on high HP. It can be particularly misleading or deceptive in that it looks like you're perfectly healed. You'll just kind of look down and notice like, oh, I don't have as many health bar segments as I used to have, and that's because you literally potentially have all the way up to half the HP you normally have, and so that can make it to where you can die a lot easier. And if you're just kind of halfway glancing at your health bar, it's like, well, I'm fully healed, and turns out you really only have 50% HP. Next up, we have Drain, which is essentially the exact same thing for energy. So this is done by shock creatures on shock worlds, and yeah, it's the same thing. Rank 1 through 5 is either 10% all the way through 50% reduce maximum energy. This isn't that big of a deal unless maybe you rely on rapid fire weaponry and burn through a lot of energy. Since my playstyle is usually focused around careful aiming and lots of dodging, this doesn't bother me too much, although it is kind of annoying because once it wears off, you have to eat some food to restore that energy. So it's a little bit annoying. And then finally, there is the ice or the frozen debuff. These naturally come from the chilling creatures, and this is the one that for the life of me, I mean, for the longest time, nobody's ever known what this actually does. But if you look in the description that's now available, what it's supposed to do is basically make all the blocks feel like you're walking on ice. Which, if you're familiar, the quirk that does the exact same thing isn't working and this debuff isn't working. My guess is that there's some kind of underlying code that needs to be implemented to make this possible, and it just hasn't been really a high priority to get around to implementing it. So for the time being, it does absolutely nothing. Rank 1 all the way through rank 5 does the exact same thing. It's a minus 1.45, which I'm not exactly... I mean, it talks about reducing friction, so I'm not really sure if that's what ice equals. I kind of wonder. It suggests that higher ranks are supposed to be even slippier, which makes me wonder, it's like, well, what if you have the debuff and you're already on ice because, hello, it's a chill world, it's already almost completely covered with ice. So, yeah, you might just kind of slip off into oblivion. You know, I guess you could use a grapple to kind of lock yourself into place or change your direction if you really had to, but yeah, for the time being, it's not quite working. Okay, I think that covers the elemental debuffs pretty well, and I've done a sufficient amount of rambling. This was Jiivita. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you want to see more like this, and if there's anything you didn't like, please let me know down below. Also, if you like my channel, want to get cool perks, check out my Patreon page. Until next time, peace.